Welcome back to Art of Citizenry podcast, where we unpack the systemic power structures that have shaped culture, politics, and policy. I'm your host, Manpreet Kaur Kalra.
And I'm Anna Canning.
This episode is part of our Private Equity Playbook series, where we break down how private equity is quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, reshaping all aspects of our lives.
We've talked about coffee, we've talked about crafts, topics that both of us are deep into. Today, we are talking about college sports.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, college sports was never something I gave much thought to until I met my now partner. And I would honestly be letting him down if I didn't insert a "Go Blue" in this episode. So there it is, I suppose. But in all seriousness, college sports fans are an incredibly loyal base.
And this is why it is interesting to see private equity entering this mix. So we're diving into what might be actually the most transformative deal in college sports history. So in December 2025, the University of Utah became the first major college athletic program to take private equity investment, opening the door for Wall Street to do to college athletics what it's already done to Toys R Us, Jo-Ann Fabrics, emergency rooms, nursing homes, and countless other institutions that have become financial instruments to make a few people much richer. The University of Utah's Board of Trustees unanimously approved a plan to spin off much of its revenue-generating athletic operations into a for-profit company called Utah Brands and Entertainment, LLC. And this for-profit company was done in partnership with the New York-based private equity firm Otro Capital. So remember, University of Utah, public university, those are by definition nonprofits, but they have now spun off this for-profit company.
Yeah, and that's really important to remember because despite what most press coverage has been, this isn't a story about adapting to the new landscape of college sports. It's really about extraction, financialization, and about college athletes who generate billions in revenue being repositioned as assets in a private equity portfolio.
Yeah, and so you might be wondering, did Utah just sell its athletic department? And the short answer is no, but it also gets more nuanced. Because as we've seen throughout this series, it's not just about like one deal, it's about a whole business model that treats everything, including the labor of college athletes, as something to be cashed out.
Yeah, and that nuance we're talking about here gets to the heart of college sports in some ways. But before we dive deeper, we need to understand the body that regulates college sports, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, so the NCAA, which oversees 1,000 schools. The NCAA is a nonprofit organization that enforces compliance, eligibility rules, and organizes championship games. Its nonprofit status, frankly, blows my mind because despite generating over $1 billion in annual revenue from television and marketing rights, it operates as a tax-exempt entity. And they essentially govern a whole industry built on broadcast rights, sponsorships, brand licensing, etc. And we will come back to all of this, but let's get back to Utah and the Utah deal. So we now have, as you mentioned, this for-profit entity that will oversee the University of Utah's core revenue-generating athletic operations. Meanwhile, all the things that you probably actually think about as sports will remain with the athletic department. So that's who the coaches are, the players, the scheduling, on the field operations. The university will retain majority ownership and decision-making control while Otro Capital takes a significant minority stake. Otro will receive a percentage of annual revenue. The deal is expected to bring in around $500 million in capital, a mix of private equity financing and commitments from private donors. So just to underscore, and this is important to remember with private equity, that not the whole $500 million is from Otro Capital.
All right. So Utah administrators want you to focus on two things, right? One is this $500 million capital infusion they just got. And then the other is this promise that Utah retains control, in quotes. But there is so much more to all of that. So this new company will manage the commercial side of Utah athletics. So that is everything from ticketing, concessions, and corporate sponsorships to multimedia rights, stadium operations, merchandise licensing, event-related revenues, broadcast, production, hospitality services. And then, as is the case with any investment, there is an exit strategy that outlines then how investors, in this case, Otro, that private equity firm, will get its money back out so it can take it and do what they do, invest it elsewhere. So Utah has rights to buy back Otro's stake at any time. And if nothing else, their exit horizon is defined as, 5 to 7 years. So they're going to pull their money out at that point. So this isn't like a permanent deal. Private equity firms don't do that, right? Like they don't want to hold on to assets forever. They want to buy in, buy low, and extract as much value as they can, improve profitability with the goal to then sell high. So I guess that leads us to the question, what will Utah's athletic program look like after 5 to 7 years of optimization for maximum investor returns? But before we even get to that, let's talk about why it is that college sports have even become an interesting investment opportunity for money-hungry private equity bosses.
Yeah, so there have been some major changes in college athletic compensation rules. To understand why private equity is suddenly circling around college sports, we have to talk about NIL, name, image, and likeness, and what it actually changed.
Absolutely. So for decades, college athletics operated on a contradiction, right? So universities, conferences, broadcasters, and coaches all generated enormous profits. But the players whose skill and reputation generated those billions of dollars were actually barred from earning money for it. Right. So the logic there was that they are just, students, they're amateurs, just kids going to school and enjoying a sport.
For decades, the NCAA used amateurism to justify why college athletes shouldn't be paid like professionals. They could receive scholarships, but compensation beyond that was absolutely forbidden. The NCAA argued this was what distinguished college sports from professional sports.
Yeah, and that's pretty key because that label allowed universities to avoid, wage and hour laws, collective bargaining, basic labor protections, despite the fact that the people doing this work in college sports were generating billions of dollars in revenue. And, I think it's useful to note also that those billions aren't distributed evenly across schools, right? So, schools like the University of Oregon in my hometown of Eugene have like a name brand, and they're able to score much more lucrative TV deals.
That system you're describing of considering college athletes as amateurs didn't collapse because universities had a moral awakening. It really collapsed because it became legally indefensible. A wave of lawsuits, most notably NCAA v. Alston, made clear that blanket restrictions on athletes' compensation violated antitrust law, specifically the Sherman Act, which prohibits anti-competitive agreements that restrain trade. So the Supreme Court case NCAA v. Alston specifically challenged NCAA rules that restricted education-related benefits, things like computers for school, paid internships, study abroad expenses, and postgraduate scholarships. The NCAA said that these restrictions were necessary to preserve the amateur nature of college sports, but the Supreme Court didn't just rule against the NCAA. It openly questioned the legitimacy of the entire amateurism model.
In that Supreme Court case, everyone's favorite tool, Justice Kavanaugh, wrote in agreement with the majority. And this agreement was actually pretty blunt. He essentially said, you can't run a business that's this profitable on unpaid labor and expect courts to look the other way. He called price-fixing labor, quote, ordinarily a textbook antitrust problem and warned that the NCAA is, quote, not above the law. And here's the critical part that Kavanaugh added. The NCAA and its member colleges are suppressing the pay of college athletes who collectively generate billions of dollars in revenues for colleges every year. Those enormous sums of money flow to seemingly everyone except the student athletes. End Kavanaugh quote. So let's call it what it is: wage suppression and an illegal restraint on workers' ability to receive fair market compensation for their labor. To think, Kavanaugh actually had something reasonable to say about labor rights. So Justice Kavanaugh raised what he called serious questions, in quotes, about whether any of the NCAA's remaining restrictions on athlete compensation could survive legal scrutiny. He was basically sending a signal to every plaintiff's attorney in America: come at him. And that's what they did.
Yeah, within days of the Alston decision, the NCAA scrambled to adopt new NIL policies, allowing athletes to profit from their name, image, and likeness. Now, let's talk about labor rights, because this is where it gets really interesting. The Alston case exposed what labor economists have been saying for years. College athletes, particularly in revenue-generating sports like football and basketball, are workers in an exploitative system. The NCAA generates over $1 billion annually. Coaches make millions. Yet the athletes whose labor creates this value were restricted from receiving fair market compensation.
So that Alston decision laid the groundwork for what came next, which was the House v. NCAA settlement, which was approved in June of 2025. This settlement requires schools to pay nearly $2.8 billion in back damages to athletes, and starting in July 2025, allows schools to share up to approximately $20.5 million per year directly with athletes, which is set to rise annually to over $32 million by 2034.
Yeah, and to think about that for a moment, coaches make millions, athletic directors make millions, conference commissioners make millions. The NCAA signs billion-dollar broadcast deals. Universities build training facilities, and the athletes who generate all of this revenue, they were prohibited from receiving compensation beyond a scholarship. So to really put this into perspective, let's get into these numbers. The highest paid college athletics coach right now makes $13.3 million from Georgia. Then you have LSU's coach at $13 million. And of course, J.D. Vance's alma mater, Ohio State, I refuse to say the Ohio State, who makes around $12.6 million. So schools now face an immediate $20.5 million annual obligation that really didn't exist before, costs that they failed to historically account for in their budgets until the law actually required them to. It's like the fair wage argument. I don't need to pay fair wages unless regulations require me to. And then all of a sudden, my business model just doesn't work. I wonder why.
This is where Utah's deal starts making a bit more contextual sense, right? So you've got these top tier schools and their conferences that get these sweet licensing deals. It's going to be a pain for them to have to pay these student athletes that they haven't had to compensate before, but it'll be doable because the money is there. But then you've got these more mid-tier schools like Utah, and they are not pulling the same kind of audience. They don't have that kind of brand recognition or, the critical billions of dollars in broadcast deals. And so the revenue, not really there, but they're going to have to start to pay these student athletes. So it starts to make sense why it would be appealing for Utah to get this infusion of private equity money. And so here we are. And we're also looking at one of these predictable leaves out of the private equity playbook that we've seen before, buy what's perceived as an undervalued brand, pump up that brand, cut the costs, and cash in.
I do want to quickly talk about the we retain control narrative. Utah's athletic director chairs the board, sure. The university's foundation appoints the majority of board members, sure. But Utah transferred every single commercial revenue stream to this new for profit entity. And so the operational personnel from these departments are no longer going to be university employees. Utah Brands and Entertainment LLC is a for profit company with private equity investors who are expecting returns. I think that's important because they're not in it for, oh my gosh, I really believe in the University of Utah. They're expecting returns in this deal. That is how this works. So, for over a century, college athletics operated within universities as extracurricular programs, right? Serving educational missions. Yes, they generate revenue. Yes, they had commercial aspects, but they were fundamentally part of nonprofit educational institutions with specific public purposes and tax-exempt status.
University of Utah President Taylor Randall framed this as being necessary to, quote, thrive in the new revenue sharing and NIL era. But let's be precise about what that means. It means that athletes are finally being compensated, and so universities are just scrambling to financialize everything possible to avoid paying that compensation out of their existing budgets.
The labor rights implications are truly profound. The NCAA and universities have fought viciously to prevent athletes from being classified as employees. The fight is ongoing in multiple courts. The Utah legislature even passed a law explicitly stating college athletes are not employees. If athletes are eventually classified as employees, this would open the floodgates. We're talking about minimum wage, overtime, workers' compensation, the right to organize, and of course, collective bargaining. We're talking hundreds of thousands of lawsuits because for all intents and purposes, they are already acting as they are employees.
Universities and the NCAA know that once athletes are legally recognized as employees, the entire structure collapses. In the theme of weird labor stories that I love to follow, University of Dartmouth, their basketball players briefly unionized and then dropped that effort. The Johnson v. NCAA case, which is still moving through the court system, could actually establish that Division I athletes are employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is that law that shapes a lot of basic labor protections that we think about. But, for those student athletes to get union recognition, that organizing would have to happen program by program, school by school, which would be, potentially a really arduous, long process.
Yeah. And then there's the establishment of the transfer portal by the NCAA in 2018, which is also another piece of the story, which essentially is this online database where athletes can signal their intent to transfer schools. Plus, this whole thing with NIL, players can move from one school to another, and schools are going to be competing to give them the best offer possible, which on the surface sounds great for athletes. But what we're really seeing now is the financialization of these institutions, right? So the best example of this is actually out of Indiana, which went from a struggling football team for decades to a playoff contender in 2 years. And that was a team almost entirely built using the transfer portal. So schools with more capital can compete and really get the best players. And private equity deals offer that stream of capital.
Yeah, so that transfer portal really accelerates wealth concentration is what I'm hearing. Programs with better NIL infrastructure and more capital can drain talent from schools that can't compete financially. So smaller programs become stepping stones. This is the chaos that private equity is betting on, I think. Utah partnering with Otro Capital isn't just about funding revenue sharing. It's also about competing in a financialized talent market where rosters turn over annually and the programs with the most capital win.
So that is the context that we're working with, right? With college athletics departments scrambling, private equity is circling like a hawk. They can smell the desperation and the opportunity. Private equity firms looked at the house settlements, like $20.5 million annual obligation, and saw an opportunity. Universities need capital to cover these payments without cutting into coaches' salaries or administrative budgets. Private equity will provide that capital in exchange for a cut of all future revenue. Enter Otro Capital.
Otro Capital was founded in 2023 by 4 partners who had all previously worked together at Redbird Capital Partners, which is one of the most successful sports-focused investment firms out there. There are a couple of guys, and yes, they are, again, all guys. Alex Scheiner, Brent Stalick, Niraj Shah, and Isaac Halyard. So the first 2 guys have a long history in sports. Alex Scheiner is the most prominent name. So from 2013 to 2016, he was president of the Cleveland Browns. Before that, he spent some years with the Dallas Cowboys as the senior vice president and general counsel. So, he's not just like some finance guy who's come up through, I don't know, all the Wall Street firms or whatever. He's run NFL franchises, right? He's negotiated stadium deals, managed the finances of professional sports organizations. Like, he really gets the economics of sports. Brent Stalick was the operating partner at Redbird Capital, and then before that also served as the president of One Team Partners, which is a different company that manages group licensing rights for players' associations. He also served as the executive vice president and chief revenue officer of the Cleveland Browns. And he also held positions with the San Diego Padres, Dallas Cowboys, and the Arizona Diamondbacks.
As you mentioned, the people behind Otro Capital are from Redbird Capital Partners, which, of course, led me down another rabbit hole. Here we are. Okay, so Redbird invests in industries across sports and media. They have invested in AC Milan, a football, or as our American listeners like to call it, soccer team. One of their most high-profile recent moves was investing in Skydance Media and being involved with the subsequent Paramount merger, which we did talk about on this podcast previously in episode 32. Just for anyone who's curious. Now, the investment that caught my attention the most was actually one that collapsed shortly after. So around November 2025, Redbird Capital pulled out of a deal to buy right-leaning UK legacy media platform Telegraph Media Group. The details of that deal are where things get interesting. So Redbird created a joint venture with Abu Dhabi's IMI Group, which is owned by the royal family. So the original deal that was majority funded by the IMI, but that sparked much controversy because Telegraph's own journalist blew the whistle on Redbird's ties to China, stating it could face investigations as a potential national security threat. And a few months later, a group of freedom of expression and human rights organizations came together to write an open letter raising concerns. To me, what is especially revealing is not just that the deal failed, but honestly, why? It exposed how private equity can use complex ownership structures to blur lines of control, accountability, and influence, which, we know is not exclusively private equity. It is a capitalism thing in a nutshell. Now, I know that's not the focus of this episode, this rabbit hole, but I do think we need to understand the firm these guys are coming from to understand the approach to private equity that Otro Capital has, since Otro itself is a relatively new firm launching in 2023.
So, these are the guys that then went on to found Otro Capital. And Otro describes itself, as they're pitching themselves in the world and to investors and whatever, as being, operator-led, which means that they bring what they describe as executive experience to drive commercial growth in what they're describing as, under-monetized assets. So their investment thesis is straightforward, right? Like find sports teams with strong intellectual property, but underdeveloped commercial operations, and then apply, this operational expertise that they have in ticketing, sponsorship, media rights to make the money rain, or, in the classy words, unlock value. Before Utah, Otro's portfolio also included a 24% stake in Formula One racing team, BWT Alpine, which is valued around $900 million when they invested at the beginning in 2023. Two Circles, which is a sports marketing and data platform that helps sports leagues, including the NFL, the PGA, or Professional Golf Association, Formula One racing, Premier League football. It helps all of those leagues sell more tickets, manage the licensing, and their other digital media strategies. Flexwork Sports, which runs sports camps where young people can, go and practice sports, and they do it with pro athletes. So Otro's thing is definitely making money on the business of sports. And, they're also getting sports money to do it. So celebrity players like Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, Ryan Reynolds are all investors in Alpine through Otro Capital.
Just weeks before the Utah announcement, Otro closed its first fund at $1.2 billion. This is the largest first-time dedicated sports buyout fund ever raised globally, which is particularly interesting at a time when private equity firms are being hit by a slow deal market and having a hard time exiting their investments. It's impressive that they raised such a significant fund. One of their major investors is actually CalPERS, the California Public Employees Retirement System, which committed $50 million. This is the largest public pension fund in the United States. It manages retirement and health benefits for more than 1.5 million California public workers and their families.
CalPERS truly seems like it's invested in nearly every private equity fund I ever look up. They actually have the largest amount invested in private equity funds globally, second only to the pensions of all of the whole entire country of Canada's public pension system, just to give you a sense of scale. Of course, it's not known if all of California's $50 million investment is going directly into Otro's investment in the University of Utah's athletic program, because that fund that they've built up is also going to multiple other investments. And of course, it's also not clear where the rest of Otro's capital comes from because, once again, it's a private company, which means that they are subjected to limited disclosure requirements.
Absolutely. CalPERS investment is only known because it is a public institution, which is why we know that CalPERS currently invests in over 400 private equity funds, which could be a whole other rabbit hole that I will this time refrain from going down. But back to Otro. In a recent interview with Otro's Alex Shiner, he specifically named college athletics as an area of interest, saying, quote, "It's obvious that collegiate sports is going through a transformation, and we believe that groups that have operational experience and backgrounds could be able to help universities and colleges navigate this new terrain."
Yeah, so Mark Harlan, Utah's athletic director, emphasized this is not a pure capital, in his words, play. That said, I'm not sure what else it could be. This deal is framed as a partnership in which both sides, quote, share risk, but that's something that private equity firms pretty much just never do. Instead, they structure investments to limit risk through all sorts of financial tricks. The university remains exposed to risks, regardless of if this investment succeeds or fails. Remember, private equity's risk here is time-bound, while the university's risk is structural and ongoing.
Absolutely. Private equity investments are not feel-good projects. They are designed to maximize profits. The Sling published an article in which they mentioned the Friedman Doctrine, which in plain terms talks about how corporations have no duty to social responsibility, which holds true especially for private equity, where revenue takes utmost priority. Recognizing that men's sports, particularly football and men's basketball, are incredibly popular and have high revenue generating potential. I think it's worth tracking what kind of decisions we are going to start seeing in regards to how the investment is distributed, because I don't think it is unreasonable for us to speculate that women's sports will likely be hit hard, which becomes a whole Title IX concern, which prohibits sex based discrimination in education, including college sports, requiring that schools provide equal opportunities to male and female athletes. But if women's sports aren't considered the primary money generators for schools and private equity is all about return on investment, you can see where concerns about equitable distribution of opportunity might start to arise. And some of this already exists anyways for female athletes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you started to get into this, which, the article does in more depth, right? That like men's basketball, football are the big name revenue sports, but there are 18 other sports teams at Utah. And well, like gymnastics, women's basketball, track and field, swimming, whatever, like they may not bring in the big bucks in terms of TV and broadcast, all of that, but people still play those sports. People still get scholarships that get them into college that they might not otherwise be able to attend on the basis of those sports. And, I don't necessarily love it, but college sports is one of the big ways that universities advertise their institutions out in the world. That Sling article really spells it out. So in the United States, 58% of college students are women. What happens to those numbers if college sports become a thing that's only really for the men's sports that generate the most revenue? Does it make recruiting and retaining women as students harder? Obviously, that's all speculation, but that's not even like my own lefty feminist analysis. That's coming from a sports economist. Overall, it just seems like another step in turning the university into a business instead of an educational institution. Otro has that portfolio of pro sports companies, and now it looks like they're betting on college sports and the prospects of its continued professionalization. So I think they're betting that they can find revenue streams to exploit. And, as we've seen over and over with this private equity playbook, where there is a will, there is a way. And it doesn't matter who suffers along the way, as long as the firm's investment is protected and those guys at the top are making more money.
Yeah, and Otro had pitched similar deals to other schools, including at least one Big Ten institution before Utah pulled the trigger. So I am curious if other institutions will soon follow. That said, there is chatter that the Big Ten Conference is toying with the idea of a $2 billion private capital investment. The investment would create a separate commercial entity that would control things like media rights, sponsorships, and branding. So similar to what we see with what Utah is doing. And I'm guessing that the bet is that with more money, they could pump up those name, image, and likeness deals, go hard on marketing, and quite frankly, cash in. But in another interesting rabbit hole, one of the entities that's offering a lot of analysis on this deal online is the law firm Morgan Lewis. Morgan Lewis has been at the forefront of dismantling the National Labor Relations Board and represents corporations such as Tesla, Amazon, Starbucks, etc. Their specialty is union avoidance and or busting. And in a recent article, the folks at Morgan Lewis, they really sell the promise of private equity in college athletics. And they basically say, as financial pressures are increasing, we can see private equity stepping in and they're going to effectively generate some really, quote, sizable returns for universities and investors. So let's be frank. This was never about making sure we are able to pay student athletes fairly. It was about money and more money.
So just to recap, right? Like we began with some legal cases that started out by arguing a pretty straightforward value. College athletes should be able to get paid for their labor. Full stop. No sooner does this ruling come down, then we see the vultures of capital start to circle to get in on the action. There's obviously a lot to unpack when an anti-union law firm gets excited about a deal that some are framing as an inevitable outcome of labor needing to get paid. But to bring it back to the heart of the issue, I think, private equity is now able to profit off of a legal contradiction. Courts have acknowledged that college sports function like a labor market. Universities now admit that athletes have to get a share of that revenue. But because athletes are still denied worker status, their profits can be reorganized, monetized, and sold.
And then there's governance, right? On paper, the university retains control, but private equity does not need formal control to shape outcomes. Influence shows up through revenue targets, board conversations, strategic planning, and the constant pressure to, quote, unlock value. When an investor's return depends on growth within a 5 to 7 year window, that time frame quietly becomes everyone else's problem.
Exactly. So, decisions that might have once been debated in terms of educational mission or student welfare start getting filtered through a different question, right? Like, does this grow the business? Yes or no? And that's where that tension creeps in. You have different entities with different definitions of success. The American Council on Trustees and Alumni warned that these deals shouldn't proceed without, full institutional approval and transparency. But transparency is exactly what private equity is built to avoid. The Big Ten proposed deal has been criticized for lack of transparency, with accusations that conference leadership is pressuring member institutions to accept terms without adequate disclosure or democratic process. So
Yeah, and because now you've got a for-profit entity sitting alongside a public university, that raises real questions. What meetings are subject to open records laws? What contracts are shielded as proprietary business information? When something goes wrong, who is held accountable, right? This is all happening right now. So the answers to those questions remain to be seen, but the deal has triggered pushback at the state level. A Utah state representative introduced HB 297, a law that would require public universities to obtain explicit legislative approval before entering into any private equity agreement related to college athletics. And following on the heels of that, legislators in my home state of Washington have introduced a similar bill. It seems like the race is on between lawmakers and profiteers to decide the future of college sports.
I feel like the University of Utah and Otro Capital want you to believe that this is a win-win partnership, right? Like Utah gets capital and expertise, athletes get compensation, fans get better experiences, investors get returns, aka more money, right? Everybody wins. But we've heard this story before, right? This is the same logic that has turned hospitals into profit centers, that's turned nursing homes into investment vehicles, that's turning like elementary school education into charter school portfolios managed by hedge funds. It is overall the logic of treating everything, including public institutions, as assets to be optimized for investor returns. So private equity doesn't enter these sectors, to support public missions for the greater good and all that. It's there to extract value. And it creates the problems that it claims to solve, right? It extracts resources, hollows out institutions, and ultimately leaves communities worse off.
And it's not like we can just opt out, right? We've mentioned this in our previous episode. If you're a student athlete at Utah, you don't get to choose whether private equity manages your commercial rights. If you're a fan, you don't get to vote on whether Otro Capital takes a stake in your team. If you're a taxpayer subsidizing this public university, you don't get to decide whether investor returns become the driving metric for decisions. Thank you you, as always, Anna, for joining me in conversation. As longtime collaborators, bringing together this series has been a great way for us to turn our long text message conversations into something deeper that we can share with all of you. So thank you for listening. If there's a company, industry, or deal you want us to explore next, share it with us. You can DM Art of Citizenry on Instagram or email podcast@artofcitizenry.com. As always, Art of Citizenry exists to slow things down, to make space for critical thinking and collective imagination. If you found this episode meaningful, please share it, subscribe, give it 5 stars, leave a review, do all the things. It helps more people find these conversations. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener supported. I hope you'll consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Thank you to our producer, Aliana Ray, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music by Katrina Zemrak.